Hello, and welcome to Building an Accessible Canada. My name is Rob Etoff, and I'm the CEO of Easter Seals Canada. On behalf of all of us here, we're delighted to welcome you and thank you for joining us from communities across Canada, but literally also around the world. I'd like to start by recognizing the broad and diverse community gathered here today. You know, those with disabilities, their families, caregivers, service providers, sector leaders, and allies. Your presence here speaks to the shared commitment to build a Canada where accessibility and inclusion are not just aspirations, but realities experienced by everyone. Prior to beginning our discussions, it's important that we acknowledge the lands on which we gather and reflect on our shared commitment to reconciliation. To do so, I'm pleased to invite Julia McKeithrin, a National Coordinator of Indigenous Disability Canada, BCANDS, and a valued partner in this conference, to provide our land acknowledgement this morning. Over to you, Julia.
Miigwech, thank you, Rob. Ani Bojo, Julia Indigenakash, Omami Wanini, Marus Karini, Anishinaabe Kwayandao, Whitney Ndonjaba, Makwa Nindoram. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia McKeithrin. I am an Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and mixed settler woman from the Madawaska Valley, and Bear is my clan. And as Rob mentioned, I'm also in a professional capacity as the National Coordinator of Indigenous Disability Canada and the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. I'm currently calling in today from my office on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, which is known colonially or known today as Ottawa, Ontario. And as we all gather for this virtual conference, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we're listening or watching or joining from across Turtle Island, we are all on Indigenous lands. And now, although National Accessibility Awareness Week has passed, I think it's especially meaningful that we are continuing to have these conversations also during June, which is the month of National Indigenous History Month. And in the spirit of National Accessibility Week, both invite us to reflect on the importance of inclusion, accessibility, and belonging, while also recognizing the rich histories and culture and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and persons with disabilities as well. And I think it's interesting that this event, it's happening in spirit of NAW, but not during NAW, but I think that's fantastic because it's such an important reminder that these conversations cannot only happen just for 1 week of the year. And building an accessible and inclusive Canada requires ongoing dialogue and learning and collaboration. And as we all work towards a more accessible Canada, we must also recognize how accessibility and reconciliation are very much connected and intertwined, where reconciliation addresses the systemic barriers created through colonial systems or actions. Accessibility requires the removal or the lack of creation of barriers that prevent people from fully participating in society. So both call on us to create communities and workplaces and systems where everyone, regardless of their identity, has the opportunity to contribute and belong. I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of this conversation, and I'd like to thank Easter Seals and CCRW, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, our panelists, and of course, all of you who are joining virtually. Thank you, Miigwech, for your commitment to this work and to this learning. And I'd like to say Miigwech, Kichimanatu, thank you to the creator as well for bringing us all together today, although virtually. And I do hope that our conversations today are guided by openness and respect and a willingness to learn and to listen for each other and creating an accessible Canada for all. Thank you, Rob. Miigwech.
Thank you, Julia, for helping us begin today's conference in a good way, and for reminding us that Building a more inclusive Canada, as you said, requires listening, learning, and collaboration. National Accessibility Week is an important time to celebrate progress, to recognize, the incredible advancements that have been made in policy awareness and innovation across communities and sectors. We've seen meaningful change, driven by advocacy, leadership, partnership, and lived experience. At the same time, we're certainly also reminded on a daily basis that there is still important critical work ahead. Too many barriers continue to exist, barriers to employment and transportation, housing, education, and recreation, barriers that impact full participation in our communities and in our economy. As you may be aware, this conference was originally scheduled to occur on June the 2nd during National Accessibility Week. Despite careful planning, unfortunately, the accessibility functionality was unavailable, and thereby impeding our ability to make this event accessible for all participants. And while unfortunate, the situation certainly highlighted in real time, the barriers that still exist and why it's critical that we continue to intentionally engage in critical dialogue needed to initiate and affect change. And that's something that we've been trying to reinforce through our ongoing conversations, with government officials and various different stakeholder groups. Prior to proceeding to our conference, we are wonderfully pleased that we do have some government representation, and we are joined today. It's my pleasure to invite Leslie Church, our Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Jobs and Families, to offer a few remarks on behalf of the Minister and to help set the context for our conversations today. We're truly grateful for Leslie's leadership and advocacy, and we thank her for being a champion of this important work to advance accessibility and inclusion for Canadians with disabilities.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Leslie Church, le secrétaire parlementaire pour la ministre de l'Emploi et des Familles pour personnes en situation de handicap. C'est mon grand plaisir de vous accueillir à cette conférence aujourd'hui, Bâtir un Canada accessible. Ce qui rend cette conférence si importante, c'est qu'elle rassemble des personnes qui ne travaillent pas toujours dans les mêmes espaces, mais qui partagent une responsabilité commune pour bâtir un pays plus juste, plus durable et plus accessible. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this important conference and conversation on accessibility and inclusion and how to build an accessible Canada. I want to salute the work of Easter Seals Canada, of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, and on Indigenous Disability Canada for their work in bringing together this conversation. Building an inclusive and accessible Canada means making sure that everyone is included in our country, in our housing, in our employment, in our schools and workspaces, in our communities. It's not a nice to have, it's a must to have. And it means ensuring that all of us have opportunities to reach our potential in everything that we do. So thank you for holding this conference in the month of June, a month when we celebrate National Accessibility Week. And I wish you all the best for an excellent conversation.
Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Church, for your remarks and for your continued commitment to building a more accessible and inclusive Canada. Here at Easter Seals Canada, we're proud to work alongside government officials like Leslie, our provincial partner organizations and disability organizations across the country to advance inclusion and drive meaningful and systemic change. But no single organization or sector can build an accessible Canada alone. Progress depends on collaboration and listening to the voices and experiences of those with disabilities. That spirit is, reflected in this conference. By bringing together diverse perspectives and sharing ideas and exploring innovative solutions, we move accessibility forward, not only in principle, but in practice. Because when accessibility is built into the way we design our communities, our systems and services, Canada becomes stronger, more inclusive, and more prosperous for everyone. Through our panel discussions, which we're about to lead into, we're looking forward to exploring 4 key areas that are critical to building a more accessible Canada. First, we'll discuss housing and accessible design, recognizing that where and how we live shapes our ability to participate in our communities. Next, we'll examine employment and AI, exploring how emerging technologies can either remove barriers or unintentionally create new ones. In our third panel, we'll look at sport and leisure, where inclusion creates opportunities for connection, health, confidence, and community participation. In our final panel, we'll be discussing procurement and economic participation, including how purchasing decisions can help create opportunities for Canadian entrepreneurs and businesses owned and operated by people with disabilities. So prior to kicking things off with our first panel, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to Employment and Social Development Canada for its support of this conference and for its ongoing commitment to advancing accessibility and inclusion across the country. Their investment has helped make today's event possible. And we are equally grateful to our project partners, the Canadian Council of Rehabilitation and Work, or CCRW, and Indigenous Disability Canada. And finally, thank you to all of our speakers, panelists, and moderators. We believe that the ideas shared today, the partnerships strengthened, and the conversations sparked have the true potential to create meaningful impact well beyond this event. And to our attendees, on behalf of Easter Seals Canada and our board of directors, thank you for being here and for the work you do every day to build a more accessible and inclusive country. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel focused on housing and accessible design.
Hello, everyone. I have the absolute pleasure of moderating our first panel today focused on accessible or housing and accessible design. And personally, I think this is an especially important conversation to be having during National Indigenous History Month, as we know that many Indigenous communities in particular continue to face both significant housing challenges and barriers to accessibility within the built environment. So from my position, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn from our panelists today to explore what it truly means to build homes and communities that are accessible from the very beginning. So in this panel in particular, we'll be discussing what accessible housing looks like in practice, the barriers that people continue to face across urban, rural, and remote communities, and the role that lived experience, policy, design, and innovation all play in creating a more accessible Canada. And as Canada faces a growing housing crisis and builds new housing at an unprecedented rate, we have a major opportunity, and not only opportunity, a major responsibility to ensure that accessibility is built in from the beginning and not added later as an afterthought. So that being said, I'm honored to be joined by 2 incredible panelists bringing expertise in lived and living experience, accessibility standards, policy, design, and innovation. With us today, we have Uli Egger, who is the Senior Specialist of Strategic Partnerships and Outreach with the Rick Hansen Foundation. And he brings a deep expertise in accessible design and the built environment, informed by professional and lived experience. He's conducted hundreds of accessibility ratings across Canada and works closely on accessibility certification and standards development. So welcome, Uli. We also have Matthew, or Matt Shaw, who is the head of accessibility practice and innovation from the Rick Hansen Foundation and is widely recognized for his leadership in accessibility, policy, and inclusive design. And Matt brings a unique perspective shaped by lived experience and a strong focus on innovation and systems change. So it's my pleasure to welcome you both today. And I'm not sure if both of you would like to take a moment to maybe introduce yourself a little bit better, if there's anything that I'm missing that you'd like to share before we dive into the first question.
I think you nailed it well for both of us. I think we could probably just go right into the questions, but I'm going to speak for myself. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for having us. We're really looking forward to this great discussion today.
Agreed. Let's do it.
Perfect. So maybe to start us off, we'll ground this conversation in what accessible housing actually means in real life. And as we know, Canada's housing crisis hits harder for persons with disabilities in particular. So my question for you both is, what does accessible housing actually mean to you? And what does it look like in your world? And perhaps, Uli, I'll start with you.
Sure. First question I would start with is accessible for who? And because it could mean different things to different people. If you're a person that has a mobility disability, that's one sort of category that we would look at. But there's also people that are deaf-blind, people that are neurodiverse. So we have all the different things that we would look at for a residential home. And depending on where you live in Canada too, what does that look like? It's different here in Surrey, British Columbia, where I live. It's easy to build an accessible home here. It might be a little bit more difficult in the north, where we can have 6 feet of snow, or where Matt Shaw lives. He can have lots of snow there also. We don't typically get that kind of snow. So you have to put those considerations into your design. You might need to have shelter at an entrance rather than just a straightforward entry that you commonly see here on the wet coast, is the way I like to describe it here. And also, thinking about disability can be temporary or it can be permanent. You can have a temporary disability like a broken limb, and that might take you out of commission for a month, 2 months. And if you have a home that has steps going up into it and has steps going up to the bedrooms, etc., all these things can affect your ability to enjoy your home in a very meaningful way. So looking at design overall for most people and being able to visit. My wife, Kim, who's a quadriplegic, wants to go to a neighbor. She pretty much can't do that because they all have steps going up into their homes. So it affects us differently.
Yeah, I agree with everything Uli said. I mean, this is a really complex problem. But at the end of the day, accessible housing, from my perspective, is housing that works for you. And in particular, we obviously have a quantity and quality problem to housing in this country. And one of the things I think most of us agree on, if you look at the system that produces housing, just all the different people that are involved in this, from government to industry and so on, is a lot of our housing decisions are not made based on how usable and how useful it is to the people that live in them. Like, we don't actually center human experience or human use of housing as a key priority, at least not explicitly in any housing decisions that are made in our country. So the result is that we have housing, just like any other type of product or service, that is actually not all that useful or not fully useful and usable to the people that live in them. I sometimes use glib or silly analogies. Just imagine some new subdivision, single family residential project. Only every house, every 2-story house in this subdivision doesn't have stairs. Instead, it has a ladder or a climbing rope to the second floor. This would be completely preposterous under how we think about housing today. My 8-year-old son would probably love a second floor that he had to climb a ladder to, but in terms of the usefulness across the board, it is not usable and useful or practical. And so if we take that extreme example, what we're really talking about here is, how do we make housing that is able to be responsive to the needs of people living in it? And there's a lot of different layers to this question that we can unpack, but I think that's the starting point.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much. And you know what? You are making my job very easy for this. Julian, in particular, you started talking about how housing looks different depending on your location and where you live and your needs. And one thing we know is that barriers physically look very different depending on where you are, whether it's in an urban, suburban, rural, or remote area. And I'm curious, are there any themes or anything that either of you are seeing in particular across the country in terms of barriers?
You see a lot of homes constructed, and I have been through a lot of Indigenous communities throughout my life, everywhere from Bella Bella to Terrace, British Columbia, or Fort St. James. I've been all over the province here and have been invited into many different communities. And mostly I see the issue is that accessibility is an add-on. It's not really thought of from the very beginning. So a lot of homes I drive north at least once a year now. I used to drive up here up to Prince George half a dozen times a year. And you can see not just in Indigenous communities, but people who have added a ramp onto their home. And you see that commonly throughout the north. You see that, and that can be treacherous in the wintertime. You just think about the areas that get 2, 3 to 6 feet of snow, and then having to have somebody clear that off. You might have to be there a week before you can actually get in and out of your home. There's better ideas for design when it comes to building homes, rather than having a very high entryway that requires lots of steps, etc. Consider shelter instead, and that would be a greater entry. My home has no steps. It has a covered entryway, so it doesn't matter if there's 6 feet of snow or a foot of rain. We still are covered here, and you have a very safe entry that way. So that would be my biggest takeaway, is that just the overall design of homes is not conducive to living there for long term and really being able to live on one floor in the event of having a broken leg or something similar to that. It can affect us all.
I completely agree. To build on that even further, like in my earlier answer, I talked about some of the different layers to the housing problem, and these are not definitive. They take many different shapes, and this is not a complete list. But there's the matter of the physical accessibility of housing, the ability to get in, to move through it, and to use it. And the physical accessibility of housing from a variety of disability perspectives, like, yes, mobility, but what is it like to, if you are especially sensitive to certain types of products or substances or chemicals, like, is the house made from materials that negatively affect your health and respiratory system? Down to, if you are neurodiverse, like, how does your environment in your neighborhood and things impact that? Then we move on top of that, then we get into various levels of market housing and non-market housing, and the various experiences and systems that shape how we get our housing. The incredible difficulty of finding housing. If you need a home that has a particular set of features or characteristics to be useful to you, are you capable of finding it? Does it exist? Are there mechanisms by which to find it when you're beginning to look for a house or for a home or a living situation? Can I actually find? Are there ways for me to connect me to the types of housing that I want, and what are all of the circumstances I'm dealing with in there? And then there are matters of just, as people, we all have different preferences about where we want to live, how we want to live, what kinds of homes we want to live in. And people with disabilities don't have the same choice, whether they're looking at a kind of market level or on non-market housing. They simply don't have the same kinds of options and choice that the rest of us do. And so, those are all really complicated and complex parts. People can have really positive or negative experiences in any of those areas. In my case, for my story, is when I was in university, my mother had a brain aneurysm, and she was fortunate enough to survive, but it really changed everything about my family's way of life and how she moved through the world as she began to use a wheeled mobility device. And so it required my parents to move from my childhood home. They bought a new bungalow that they thought they could make work better for them. But even that was completely imperfect. And it wasn't until there was one Saturday morning, my father wakes up and all of his friends are on the yard, all of his handy friends with all of their construction materials and their saws. And they said, today is the day, we're moving walls, we're changing the stack, we're putting the ramps out front, and we're taking care of this. First of all, an amazing experience, but certainly not something that everybody has access to, not something we can rely upon. And it's an example of one of the things that you'll see persistently in whatever area of this problem you're tackling, is that the onus or the responsibility for making housing work falls onto the shoulders of the people with disabilities themselves, and that we have not effectively designed the system to create housing that is more responsive. And so that can be as simple as making homes more better prepared to be adapted in the future. That can include actually designing and catering to specific design styles for some of the benefits that they offer for different users and increasing choice, all the way down to like, how do we think about different types of housing, like single family housing, large multi-unit condo projects, smaller, denser communities, or in the case of like we're living more rurally and we're in more isolated situations, how do we think about and consider that human use and make sure that that's factored into it? Because there's no bigger decision any of us make than where to live. And I think we would all try to say we try to be really rational and long-term, and we try to maximize our agency and choice. Sometimes we don't get a lot of choice. Sometimes we don't get a lot of options. And the honest truth is we're not always very good at even identifying, I'm going to live in this home now. I hope to live in this home for a really long time. What's going to happen when I'm much older and I experience different forms of disability, or I'm not quite so mobile? Like, is my environment well suited to that? And that's a hard thing to plan too, sometimes when you're in the midst of daily life. So part of the objective for the folks that are participating in this call today, and whether you are a home occupant, whether you work in the industry, whatever your role is, we have to find a way to make the housing system naturally tilt towards producing more accessible outputs. And one of the things that the way the system works is it treats like building codes and standards and design as a kind of automatic computer script. And if we just plug the right things into that system, it's going to magically produce housing that's accessible. And we haven't fine-tuned that system by any stretch of the imagination yet, but I think that's the core barrier and what we really need to focus on.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. And Matt, I'm listening to you and so many thoughts are running through my head. I hear a lot about choice or the lack of choice. And I'm thinking about communities and how even when we have an accessible house or an accessible house to someone, the community in and of itself is also lacking in accessibility too. And so it really, really stems more than just from accessible housing. We're talking about folks participating in their daily lives and in communities so we can live a richer, full life. So lots to think about. Thank you so much. We've been talking a lot about challenges, which makes sense because there are certainly so many challenges and barriers to talk about. But I'd like to switch our focus slightly and talk about what's giving people hope or what you see is working. So I'd like to ask you both if you could share maybe one or two examples of a project or a policy or a community initiative that is getting accessibility right in terms of housing. And maybe Matthew, I'll let you start off.
That sounds great. There's a few things that I'm hopeful and optimistic for where I see some real promising potential. One thing I'm really excited about has been the release of the new standards from Accessibility Standards Canada on accessible ready housing, which is a series of strategies that could be applied to almost any type of housing project to prepare any house during the design and construction phase to be more easily adapted later later in life according to the needs of its residents. There's no reason that any housing project that's undertaken in this country could not conform to being accessible ready. So in the event of like my family story, it's very easy, and housing will become more malleable. And a greater consistency and a greater expectation that we can find this type of housing throughout the country. I'm very excited by that. I am also excited by the very slow but continuing understanding of the fact that housing as a that housing responsiveness is actually a really important value, and that if we were able to make housing that is more accessible and useful, if developers begin to see the practical applications, if we make non-market housing that's more usable and increases dignity, if we see a better mix of housing projects. Right now, we still see a lot of scattershot ad hoc projects. It's very hard to see a consistent baseline, but I do think we have a real opportunity at the federal and provincial level, if we think through a major housing strategy correctly, that we could really begin shrinking the housing crisis from a disability inclusion and accessibility point of view. Alternatively, if we are successful as a country in rapidly increasing home building in this country in all of its forms, but we do not think about accessibility and usability, then we're just going to dramatically widen the crisis. So there's a lot of hope for optimism, but some things of caution for the industry and for the country as well.
I'd like to add to that. So I'm very fortunate to sit on a design panel for the city that I live in here in Surrey, British Columbia. And I'm very encouraged to, it's usually me that's pointing out all the accessibility features that should be in place at a new condo. And mostly that's what people are considering for housing here these days are condos or apartments. And as Matt said, they could be market or could be non-profit. They could be co-op style housing. I'm very encouraged to hear the architects that sit on these panels with me are really starting to embrace the idea that these homes should be usable for everyone for long term, rather than just being able to stay in a home for 10 years and then have to move into an alternative type of housing. So I point out all the usual things, door width and visual alarms and all that sort of stuff that we would look at for accessible housing, having backing in the walls for potential grab bars, etc. But when I'm hearing the architects, especially the landscape architects, saying, that slope is too great. If I get older, I won't be able to navigate that slope, or it's too narrow, or the entryway to this building is really poor. Why do we need to have a ramp here at all? Why can't we just make the grade more level and be able to get in? Everybody uses the entry in the same way. Having units that are highly adaptable throughout the building, that's a really wonderful thing to hear. And even to get to places like the garbage room, people don't consider that journey of how would you take your garbage from your unit to a garbage room. These are things that the architects are starting to bring up as a result of us sitting, our Rick Hansen Foundation sitting on this committee. It has changed their mindset. And now they're really looking at usability for long term, increasing the number of parking spaces that they would have otherwise just done the minimum amount. Now they're doing the maximum amount and sometimes even more. It's super encouraging. And looking at that whole user journey from how you get there, how you get in the building, how you get around, and how you can actually visit somebody. If somebody lives on the 12th floor and you live on the 3rd floor, will you be able to go to that unit and have a cup of coffee with that person and enjoy their company? Or is that a barrier? Will you not be able to get into the unit because the entryway is too small? Why not just make them all the same size and make every unit visitable, adaptable, or highly adaptable? It would be so much easier for everyone in long term.
Thank you, Uli. That's a pretty promising story. Thank you for sharing. And well, knowing that a quarter of the population in Canada lives with a disability, we've got folks aging, we've got new families. It's really just a no-brainer for everyone to start thinking outside of the box and thinking about how, even if they themselves don't live with a disability, thinking about what if this were to happen. What if I am to age? What if my loved one needs some sort of accessibility feature? We really need to start thinking about the bigger picture, and thinking about Canadians. It's so important in Canadian culture to take care of our neighbor, take care of our family, take care of our friends. So we need to start thinking a little bit bigger here. I think. My next question, I might change it a little bit slightly, because I think you both touched very eloquently on what the future of accessibility and building with accessibility in mind will look like. So I'm curious to hear more about that, but maybe more so, what will it take for Canada to get there, where we do have a truly accessible country and accessible housing? Like what needs to shift culturally, perhaps, or what role do we have in getting us there?
Well, my opinion is that one of the things, and this is actually a promising trend that I think we're seeing some early fruit from, is to think about how do we incent the industry into creating more accessible housing. And we come at this from approach of not solely from a legislative compliance, but how do we really encourage and incent the industry to move in this direction. And I'm really interested in some of what we're beginning to see in the industry is we're beginning to see some incentives that actually facilitate and encourage more inclusive, accessible, and adaptable home building. We see this through some CMHC programs, which are incenting the industry towards adopting accessibility as a key project criterion. That's something that Uli and I have spoken about in the past, as we get many more phone calls from property managers, developers, and builders who call and say, we don't fully understand accessibility. We don't exactly know what to do, but we're trying to find ways to maximize our project. We see incentives and funding opportunities through some of these programs. Tell us more. How do we learn more? And then how do I bring that into our work? And so for us to really be successful as a country and as within industry and as a sector, is we need to build the system that encourages and facilitates these outcomes, that works a little bit differently from a strictly legislative or compliance point of view. Historically, we've thought about accessibility as something that we bring into building codes and minimum requirements, and we have a strong compliance and enforcement regime. And those are things that are very important, and we need those to continue to rise. But in terms of quality and setting a baseline, those areas set the floor, they're not the ceiling. When we have incentive programs that encourage and reward builders that are building towards more accessible and inclusive infrastructure and housing, in essence, we're taking the decision out of people's hands. We're making this an easier process. And I do see some positive developments in that space, and I really hope to see that continue.
I would like to say that probably the biggest barrier overall is attitudinal barriers. Builders, people that work with code, municipalities, etc., they're really not considering living in your home for a long period of time. And most of us would like to age out in our homes. I feel like I can age out in my home. It's set up for me, and it's set up for my wife. It's an easy place for anybody to come and visit. Our home is 100% visitable. So when I'm looking at homes, I look at a few key things. Can you get in the entry? That's the first barrier. Oftentimes homes are designed where they have a raised threshold, high threshold, or there's a couple steps going up into them. Why do we need to have those? Why do we need to have that barrier right at the entry? It's saying, oh, I don't want you to come visit here because I don't want you in my home. Well, that's really the message that you're sending somebody that uses a mobility device. And the code has kind of fallen to the wayside. It's getting better, but it really doesn't really meet the needs of all the users. So if you can't get into a unit or your home, and you can't get around, and you can't move about in your unit well, you can't cook a meal, you can't use the washroom, and you can't sleep in a bed, then it's not a very usable space. And that space can change as time goes on. Our colleague at work had an incident when she was in Iceland. She broke her ankle, and she lives in a townhome, a three-story typical sort of walk-up townhome. She had to stay on the main floor for 3 months because she couldn't get up the stairs. And she hated the fact that she had stairs, and she's really cognizant of her next purchase of a home is going to be a stairless place, a place that she can invite everybody over and be able to live a lot longer in the home that she chooses. So it's those attitudinal barriers saying, I don't need to do that. Why would I want to change this design? It looks really grand. You're having, 6 steps going up into a home until you break your ankle, or you have a hip surgery, or other type of ailment that can affect you as you go along in life. There's all sorts of things that can happen. Matt and I were pretty fit young guys when we were young. I'm a lot older than Matt, but I used to run. I was a runner. Now I can hardly walk upstairs. Arthritis has set in. It's not really the friendliest disability to have, but I can still function. And I'm happy to live in my own home that is built for me. So we need to think about building homes that can accommodate people as they age in place, so they can live there a long period of time and not overwhelm our extended care type of facilities, etc. That we can actually have care at home, live in the place that you love to live and are most familiar with. So I'll pass it over to Matt here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. At the end of the day, too, I mean, we could, perhaps through this webinar, we create a run on bungalow-based properties because they don't have stairs. And you know what? Bungalows have really unique attributes and features because of that. And it's not to say that every housing type needs to be a bungalow. Obviously, when we're talking about the types of decisions that industry makes, which are the things we all need to think about in our role and how those factor into it, is there are reasons we don't build giant subdivisions of bungalows these days, or it's certainly out of favor from a number of perspectives. However, we need housing mixes. We do need those different types of options. People want to live in different kinds of environments and different shapes and configurations and different layouts and different price points and market and non-market. And while it's really heartwarming to see more elegant solutions being developed, we're seeing some awareness amongst the developer community. Of course, they push back and they say, we're in a really tough environment. Things are really competitive. Every penny and every cent matters to our ability to deliver. We have a really complex regulatory environment. Help us move through that, or how do we think about that? We're already in a really tight box. How do we navigate and maneuver in this box and bring this piece in? Is a real challenge. So if we're able as a sector, as a community of people who live with disabilities, as people within industry, the more we can work towards getting the system to have the right kinds of incentives and rewards and structures to produce this, we also make it easier to take this out of conscious decision making and be something that the system produces. Like, one of the lines I frequently talk about when I talk about the housing system is that every system produces the outcome that it's designed to produce, which is to say that if you're producing inaccessible housing, if that's what's coming out of the pipe at the end of our entire housing system, it means that the parts inside of that machine are set up to produce exactly that kind of result. It's not an accident. And so if we are serious about the fact that we are aging in Canada, we want Canadians to live in their homes for longer periods of time, wherever they are in Canada, whatever kind of community that they're in. These kinds of things need to be baked in so that we can make a more efficient and effective housing system that's meeting the needs of residents.
That's great, Matt. Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. And I think persons with disabilities are so innovative and resilient, and the standards are great, and things are changing, and things are, I think, moving in a great direction. But it's so important to start having these conversations and listening to the folks with experience. Otherwise, we'll have the same old building codes that make ramps that are up to code, but yet are still too steep for true accessibility purposes. Super quick. I've got one final question before we reach time. But if you two could leave the folks listening with a final message from you, what would that message be?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say consider homes, and homes could be in like market and non-market. They could be all sorts of different configurations. It could be located anywhere in Canada. But consider having homes that are usable for most people for most of their lives. Don't design a home that is only going to last you for 5 years or 10 years. And think about, maybe you have extended family that lives with you as well. So here in Surrey, British Columbia, we have a lot of homes here that are designed that have like an in-law suite. Make that an accessible in-law suite, or make it a highly adaptable so that your aging parent or your aging sibling or your partner or your friend can come live with you, and in a very meaningful way, that they can enjoy eating a meal together, that they can get in and around, use a yard if there's a yard. If it's a condo unit or an apartment building, that there are usable features within there for everyone. It's not just, don't want to have an afterthought. You want to think about these things far ahead of time and think about the aging process and what that looks like as we go. When Kim and I were first together, which is over 40 years ago, we never thought we'd be having these discussions still to this day. We thought, boy, there's going to be big change in the next 5 years after Rick Hansen's journey around the world. Boy, we were so inspired by that. And we thought, boy, that's just going to change everything. But here we are, 40 years later, still having this discussion and still trying to make things better for most people. It is getting better. I've got to say, this is probably the best juncture in time that we've had. And for people to come on board and say, yes, let's do something positive here for us human beings here in Canada. No, regardless where you live, let's think about the human experience and be able to enjoy life like everybody else does.
Well said, Uli. I couldn't agree more. I think for my last remark, one of the things that's just the nature of this work, and everybody who's participating and listening online and watching knows this to one degree or another, one of the features of accessibility is that when it is very successful and it's very elegant, is that it is invisible, because it becomes seamless with the environment around it, and it's being practiced by fluent practitioners, people who understand how our bodies move through the world, and as people with lived experience, but also those who build and support. So one of our kind of shared challenges is showcasing the value that accessibility, usability, inclusive housing strategies may be difficult to demonstrate or to visibly see, but their impacts and their underneath everything from economics to social inclusion to other quality of life indicators that are very important to us as Canadians, that we've really been proud of over the many generations of life in this country, that we need to continue to embody those, and they need to be baked into how we think about housing, so that they are producing the kinds of spaces that we all want to live in wherever you are in the country.
Matt, Uli, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience and your knowledge today with all of us. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me personally with this whole conversation is that accessible housing is more than just the physicality or the structure of in and of itself, although that is certainly an important aspect, but it's about belonging, and it's about designing homes that work for everyone, regardless of your identity, your age, your disability or not. Is making sure that it's accessible to Canadians. So thank you again to our panelists, for those listening in, and happy celebration of National Accessibility Week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Employment and AI panel. This panel will explore the future of work because it has to work for everyone. This is National Accessibility Week, Building an Accessible Canada. So the purpose of this panel is to explore how employment is changing for people with disabilities, including how new technologies like AI are reshaping hiring, communication, and workplace systems. The conversation should highlight lived experience across rural, organizational, and systemic contexts, surface practical strategies for inclusive hiring and retention, address disclosure, accommodations, and workplace culture, explore AI's opportunities and risks, and inspire employers to build workplaces where everyone can thrive. So it's going to be an exciting panel. And we've got some incredible panelists to join us today as we moderate our discussion, as we go through our discussion, rather. We have Alex Litwin, writer, advocate, accessibility consultant, rural Manitoba lived experience, plus community leadership and rural perspectives. Alex is a disability advocate and entrepreneur living with cerebral palsy. He has served as adult ambassador for Manitoba Possible 2 terms and now sits on its board. He co-owns Willpower Media, has coached U18 AAA hockey, and holds certificates in business administration and applied counseling. He is also a writer with contributions to CBC Manitoba. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We also are joined by Erica Carson-Sammy, founder, Carco Disability Strategies, MSW, Disability Employment Specialist, Workplace Culture plus Disclosure and Accommodations and Mentorship. Erica has over a decade of professional experience and 15 plus years of volunteer leadership. She has led mentorship programs, taught at Carleton University, and worked across post-secondary institutions to improve employment outcomes for disabled graduates. She now supports disabled workers and employers through Carco Disability Strategies. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you.
So welcome, everyone. So now we're gonna open up the panel to a discussion, and we're going to talk about the reality today. We're going to start here, and we're going to open the questions. We're going to open the discussion with the following question. Finding and keeping a job is still a major barrier for many people with disabilities. What does that look like in your world? And let's start with Erica.
Hi there. So for me, I'm fairly open and upfront about my physical disability. It's invisible. I use a wheelchair. You can hear it in my voice. So I often disclose in cover letters. What that means is I don't know how many times that has affected whether or not I hear back from a cover letter or an application, rather. And this is an uncertainty that many people with disabilities live with. But when I have gotten various positions, I've generally had relatively positive experiences, but where the real kind of friction happens is when I go to talk to my managers about, okay, how do I move up in this company, in this organization, knowing that I can't do so many hours a week, I can't work overtime or take on these additional projects. You know, a lot of people want managers to work a lot more than I have the capacity to, due to things. I have a post-concussion syndrome, so I can't be on the computer for 8+ hours a day because it will make me sick. So whenever I would ask these questions, the conversation went nowhere. No one knew how to answer other than saying, well, maybe you can volunteer for this employment group, or maybe you can volunteer for you know, being on this committee, and it just never really addressed the real issue. And I think that's something a lot of people with disabilities come up against, is that upward mobility barrier, where we are very capable of being in leadership positions, but the current structure is broken and doesn't work in a way that can accommodate disabled leaders. And so this is actually what pushed me into entrepreneurship.
Congratulations. Alex, you know, your reality is a little bit different because of, you know, rural and some of your early experiences. So can you, you know, keeping a job is still a barrier, as we know, and that's why we do the work that we do. But, you know, what does that look like in your world?
So until I became a better person, I understood myself better than employers and potential employees saw me for who I was. So that's basically my journey. And, you know, this is the way the government is nowadays. I only have certain amount of help per day, so I have to make sure I do my job my way when I have help. And, most of the time I don't have help, but I have to maintain my enthusiasm and be the best person I can be, and that way I become a better role model for those around me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And so, you know, the reality today, we still have work to do, as we hear, in terms of helping people with disabilities find equitable employment. And, you know, the reality today is challenging enough. And now we have the new overlay of technology and AI. And so now we're going to shift to technology and AI. And AI and new technologies are reshaping hiring in workplaces in every sector. Where do you see the biggest opportunities and the biggest risks for disabled workers? And again, we'll start with Erica.
Yeah, so I think we're already starting to see where AI is kind of causing issues or being really helpful. I don't want to speak to recruitment, but of course, I think there are ways that I use AI to assist myself in getting through the workday. It's good to help people with disabilities in doing things that maybe don't require expertise, their expertise, but perhaps it helps in, I like to help. I like to ask it to help me do social media posts. So I write in what I what I want to say. I write it as if I were doing a post, but then I know I'm not like the best social media person, so I say, AI, please tell me that, like, how to make this sound more LinkedIn ready or more, Instagram ready. And that actually really lightens a lot of the administrative load of my job. It can also help in reading really long, dense reports and, give me a summary, and then I know where I need to later go into the report and focus my energy on certain aspects of the report that's relevant to me. So for me, it helps me as an accommodation tool in a sense, because it allows me to use my expertise and energy where they're actually needed. And it helps me as an entrepreneur who works alone most of the time. Sometimes I use it as a, I'm gonna bounce an idea off in the AI guy and see what they think about this idea. And there are opportunities to use it to our advantage. And I think as long as we always think critically, never take things exactly as AI tells us, be like scrutinize what it's giving you and think critically. I think it can be a really good tool to help accommodate certain things.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that example with the using AI to help with your social media posts.
Yeah.
Because it is something that is, that little nuance and that, that contribution can really help get that message across. And I think so that's great. And so again, I agree with you. AI can be a very useful tool, but it can't replace the lived experience that we bring.
Exactly.
So, and Alex, how about you? Where do you see the biggest opportunities and the biggest risks for disabled workers with the introduction of AI and new technologies?
Well, the biggest opportunity I think is to give people like me who have a speech impairment a bigger voice. And if we want to say something that's a little bit long-winded, it could help you say sentences that can be complicated if you're having a bad speech day or you're just having up to talking. But on the other hand, I also think lots about AI because I worked so hard and so many Canadian disabled people. I worked so hard to become part of society and not pushed into the background. And my biggest fear is that AI will take over for the disabled people. And I want a life. I don't want it to be easy. I want it to be attainable, but we still have to have goals. And if AI comes into our lives too much, we might lose purpose and we might lose who we really are. So in my mind, if things take a little bit longer, or if we have to do things a different way to get done, that's okay. But like I said before, we have to stay true to ourselves and true to our disability because our disability makes us unique. And if we take away our uniqueness, we're going to blend into the background. Nobody will see our true potential. So that's my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So the future of work, as you know, as we know, it has to work for everyone. It has to work for job seekers, it has to work for employers, it has to work for employees. So what do employers and employees need to start doing differently right now? Right now in the like today. And Erica, we'll go back to you.
Sure. Well, I just want to start by saying, even though employment is a shared responsibility between the employee and the employer, employees with disabilities have been doing what they need to be doing for a long time. But where it hasn't worked is on the employer side. So definitely raising that awareness and getting more understanding from employers about what disclosure means, how it's sensitive in nature, where to go from there with conversations about accommodations, and also looking at, mentorship. And often people with disabilities miss out on these opportunities to be mentored, and that's where we're also losing connections and ways to move around in our career and make strides and thrive to do what we want to do in our career instead of staying in the same position for many years or jumping from a pilot project to a casual position to, all the different types that aren't permanent. So I think it's really important for employers to learn how to create an environment for safe disclosure where people don't have to fear losing a job or losing projects or opportunities because they've disclosed their disability, and understand how to approach that conversation with empathy and curiosity. And understanding that accommodations change, and it's not going to be a one and done conversation where, okay, I told you I need this accommodation, we'll never talk about it again. No, you need to keep bringing it up, let the employee know they can come to you if something isn't working. And that's part of that inclusive, safe environment where people feel safe mentioning that something isn't working, knowing that that's not going to reflect their reputation.
Yeah, precisely. And so really, if, for employers, what they need to do is make sure there's an environment for safe disclosure, that accommodations are reviewed, to your point, not one and done, and offer those mentorship opportunities so that when you start in a role, that's not where you end, but that's where you begin to develop your career.
Yeah, and I also think, I mentioned disabled employees are doing what needs to be done on their part. But if they do feel safe in doing so, feel free to speak up and be like, well, this procedure, this practice is flawed and inaccessible. We need to relook this policy and see how we can make it more accessible for all employees. So there is a role that disabled employees can play, but recognizing that we need to be safe and feel safe, and it's okay if you don't to not raise those concerns.
Great, thank you. And Alex, you have a bit of a different perspective based on your lived experience and your the rule aspect of where you're at. So can you, what if the future of work is for everyone, what do employers and employees need to start doing differently right now?
So to that, there's many things. One, I want to tell people, if you think you don't want to do something because it's disabled, it's level there, go for it. You got nothing to lose. You got everything again. So like I said, if you want to go for something, go for it, and you'll be surprised with what happens.
Right? Exactly. One of the takeaways I heard, which I think is applicable to everybody, is if you want something, you go for it, right?
Yeah, and I know when I was younger, I used to be shy. If people would ask me to repeat myself, or if they didn't understand me, and they would just smile, but not know what I said. But after I got over that, and I embraced my fear, and I became a better person for it. And that's what I try to show the disabled community.
Congratulations for your perseverance. Definitely. Okay. So as we near the conclusion of our panel, we're going to talk about the future and the future that we're building together. So what does a truly accessible future of work look like for you? And we'll start with Erica.
Okay. So I think the key thing is that it doesn't look the same to everyone, and no one size fits all will work. So the key is to be flexible, open to change, and make a commitment to helping those who need support to thrive in your organization. I also think a big issue is in our current workplaces, we've kind of fallen on this default where the people who become leaders are often just the people who have been places the longest. And it's not always the case. I'm not saying people haven't earned their spots, their positions, but not as much, there's a word I'm thinking of and it's not coming to me. But we need to invest in disability training for leaders or for people who wish to become leaders. I think CCRW actually put out a white paper recently, and they said 70% of leaders don't have any training on disability besides maybe like AODA or whatever act they have in their city. And so we need to look at developing leaders who understand how to work with people with disabilities, how to help them maintain their career goals, how to adjust schedules if the current workplace might not be working for them. But to kind of go back to the main question, I think a workforce where people with disabilities can enter and move through their careers seamlessly without barriers would be one that is more truly accessible, and where career progression is not out of reach and can, help people rise out of poverty, because that's a huge issue in our community. And again, that mentorship is always really important to help you get through the barriers, the questions that you may have, get connections that might lead to your next role. And, we need to see more people with disabilities in leadership roles. So that's the goal.
Yeah, and that would be, that is the future, right? For employers to understand, have a greater understanding of disability generally, and how to support people with disabilities in particular, and also creating opportunities for growth and promotion within environments. And, if we're able to get there today, tomorrow, that's really what the future of work looks like, if I understand you correctly.
And it's not about doing the right thing or, being charitable. It's about doing what's best for your business, because people with disabilities have wonderful education, great skills. We can problem solve like no other, because we live in a world that isn't made for us. We can adapt easily, like super innovative. We even just within my home, I create things so that my house is safer for me. So I'm innovating all the time.
There was two things that I really resonated with me. One is find a way to make it work. and inclusion for all. And I think that's the future that we want to live in. You know, if we lived in a place where
Exactly.
everybody just wanted to make it work, a lot of barriers would be removed. So as we wrap up, if every employer and every employee watching today could leave with one message from you, what would it be? Erica?
Well, for employees, I would just say you're not the problem. The system is the problem. And we just need to keep doing what we're doing, keep educating ourselves the way we have, keep advocating, keep pointing out where barriers exist, but you yourself are not the problem. To employers, obviously, I would say your employee is not your problem. The problem is this way we've been taught to think about the workplace. This very rigid and narrow understanding of, oh, productivity looks like this. A good worker looks like this. And then we all saw that shifted in the pandemic. We saw great things happening for people with disabilities. Obviously, not all. It doesn't work all the time, but things were more inclusive for disabled employees. And now, I don't want to do math, but however long ago the pandemic was, we're still falling back to our old ways. We're still thinking that being in the office is the only way that we can be productive, because leaders need to see exactly what their employees are doing. And unfortunately, this is something our own government is doing. Sorry, I know you're funding it. But I like to call it the way I see it.
Exactly. Well, that's why we called you as a panelist. We need your expertise.
And I got in some sort of tangent
That's okay.
Essentially, we need to change the system to include more people, whether it's invisible disabilities, visible disabilities. We're all different, and that makes a more diverse, a more interesting workforce.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erica. And Alex, final thoughts on what you just would like to leave as a message for employers and employees.
Well, when it comes to employees, I'll start with them, and I would say, do the job that you want to do and do it your way.
Do it your way, exactly.
Let's all work together.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Erica, for participating on this panel and helping us understand what the future of work looks like for people with disabilities and for employers. And, just some quick wrap up on the themes. We heard, AI can be a tool. We need to treat it as such. We can't let it be a barrier that impedes us to doing what we want to do. And Alex spoke very eloquently about, just do it, go for it. And, we're better people for inclusion. We're better people when we accommodate. Collectively, we need to mentor. We need to create those opportunities. And the future of work is promising. As long as we keep having these dialogues, we'll continue to break down barriers. We'll continue to hear these important voices, and we'll continue to make a difference in the world. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning to some people who are tuning in. Wonderful of you all to join us here today for this Sport and Leisure Making Play Possible for All panel. Of course, I know we were supposed to do this a couple of weeks ago when we were celebrating National Accessibility Week, but here we are. The conversation continues, and it's still as important and pertinent today as it was 2 weeks ago. My name is Devin Haru. I'm a longtime CBC sports reporter. A big day, actually, in CBC, hot off the press. CBC no longer doing the NHL, which means more amateur sport, more para sport on the CBC. So it seems fitting that we're having this conversation today. We're going to be exploring how sport and leisure shapes belonging and confidence and community, and why many Canadians, of course, with disabilities still face barriers to participate fully. And we really hope that this conversation highlights through our great panelists here today why accessibility, leisure, sport matters to real people. We're also going to show how infrastructure and coaching and community design can shape participation, demonstrate how inclusive sport and leisure can transform lives. We're going to connect sport accessibility to national programs and policy and community leadership. And perhaps more than anything, we're going to inspire communities to make play possible for everyone, everywhere. All right, you're not here to listen to me talk, you're here to listen to the panelists. So let's get ready to introduce them here today. I know the Senator Chantal Petitclerc wanted to join us. She can't make it today, but what a champion Senator Petitclerc has been. 21 Paralympic medals, 14 of those golds. So thank you to the Senator for her great work in this space. Now I'll introduce someone who is here with us today, Michael Langley. Wonderful to have you here with us today, an emerging speaker, writer, pianist whose work explores the intersection of lived experience and systems thinking. Born with spina bifida, he draws on a lifetime of navigating both visible and invisible challenges to examine how perception and structures and human behavior shape our understanding of disability and inclusion. Michael just so happens to be an author. We were talking about his memoir a second ago, and I'm going to read an excerpt of it in a bit when we get into the panel. The memoir, called The Redemptive Power of Being Seen, it reflects on resilience, identity, and transformative impact of being truly understood. It is outstanding, Michael. His work expands into broader systems analysis, exploring how societies recognize and respond to structural challenges over time. And as a pianist who plays by ear, I want to know more about that, Michael. He often describes music as a great equalizer, a space where ability is redefined. His speaking, you're going to hear it today, invites audiences to move beyond surface assumptions toward deeper awareness, clarity, and connection. Michael, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Cynthia Simmons is a former competitive speed skater who proudly represented Canada at international competitions in South Korea and Austria. She began skating at the age of 5 and built her life around the sport, developing not only athletic excellence, but also confidence, resilience, and a strong sense of community through years of high-level competition. Specializing in long-distance events, Cynthia is known for her strategic racing style, including pacing, drafting. You got to find that draft, Cynthia, and well-timed passes. Following her competitive career, she has remained connected to the sport, holds a level 1 speed skating coaching certification. an engaging speaker, an experienced speaker. Cynthia has addressed audiences of big numbers, over 1,000 people in both English and French. You got to teach me French, Cynthia. I got to work on it. As an ambassador for the sport, she has also participated in many media interviews where she has shared her experience, encouraged others to explore speed skating, emphasizing confidence, sportsmanship, and a willingness to take on new challenges. Cynthia brings a wealth of experience and insight to conversations about sport, competition, and personal growth. All great things. Cynthia, it's great to see you. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
All right. Those are our panelists here today. Again, thank you everyone for tuning in wherever this finds you. So let's get right into it right away. Our first question relates to sport and recreation and how it helps people feel connected and confident. But of course, we know that many Canadians still face barriers. So Cynthia, why don't we start with you to get us started here today about what accessible sport has meant in your world?
So accessible sports in my world for speed skating. So unfortunately, one of the biggest club in Calgary closed recently. So a lot of speed skaters has retired from speed skating or has left speed skating, and it is a big barrier for the sport as a speed skater. The only place in Canada right now that has speed skating is in Montreal, is the biggest one. And unfortunately in Ontario, we do not have speed skating unless you go 2 hours away or 3 hours away from Kitchener or from Toronto, and it's only in London, Ontario. Unfortunately, that is what it is. And as this panelist and me experiencing the speed skating in the sports, I want to bring out the accessibility for the sport to open up a big club, maybe in Kitchener, maybe in Waterloo, maybe in Toronto, and have more people join the club.
Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. You know, I was actually having a conversation this past weekend with a bunch of sport leaders, and we were talking about rinks, hockey rinks, speed skating rinks, curling rinks, and that in a lot of ways, the infrastructure in those places were built years ago where they weren't thinking about accessibility. And I wonder maybe if you could tell us what your experiences have been like when you walk into these facilities, when you go into these facilities, and what it's like when you look around and you go, this was not built with accessibility in mind, because it seems to be an issue all across this country.
The accessibility, like through my career, was easy because I grew up in the north in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and there is a big, huge club in Yellowknife. So I did not have that problem. But when I came to Kitchener and I moved to Kitchener and I looked around and I'm like, there's no speed skating club. So with my passion, my goal is to maybe open up a club in Kitchener or Waterloo so that there is more people that go into the sport as a speed skater. Because a lot of people tell me speed skating is just going around circles, but in the background of speed skating, there is technique, there is ways of knowing what is a sport. It is just not going around circles like people say. There is more into it.
No kidding. And community as well. And what I'm hearing from you, and what might be a theme throughout today, is that when you don't have that ability to do that, you don't have the community that you want. And so it's, to your point, it's a lot more.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. Okay, thank you for that. Michael, over to you. In your case, of course, a pianist who plays by ear. So what is that meant in your world about confidence and feeling connected? And what has that meant to you in your life?
Well, it's meant a great deal. I mean, when I was growing up and younger, I sort of made a point of trying to disappear, actually, and be as unnoticeable as possible. But I realized that, well, I knew how to play by ear, but I originally started playing at the church in the summertime at a, in the young people's, and they really seemed to really like it. So from there, I ended up applying at a, a lounge in a restaurant here in Victoria. And serendipitously, the pianist that was there, he was an internationally known, he shot his finger off with a shotgun, and he was unable to play anymore. The new owner was a cheapskate, and he was looking for somebody he could hire who didn't have to pay nearly as much. And me, being a novice, said yes with a great deal of enthusiasm. So that's kind of how it started. And I realized that, I don't have a great technique. It's partly because of my spina bifida. My coordination isn't the best, but I realized I could move people emotionally. And that was a great equalizer. And also I used to play at, I used to go dancing once a week at the Princess Mary. And they asked me to play the piano at the Christmas time. So I realized how much of a difference that made when they realized that that was part of my, my repertoire. And the women especially seemed to react to me quite differently. And I think a great equalizer was also the dances. I mean, my parents thought, why are you going to dances? I mean, why would you want to do that and put yourself out there like that? But I found that there was a lot of shy men there, and they used to sit there and watch me. And they used to watch me in the sense that they watched who I asked to dance, and they figured, I guess it was that's a double-edged sword in a sense, but they figured that if those women danced with me, they would be able to dance. They'd be easy to ask to dance. So I was sort of I guess a good witness for them, that they, and provided them with some confidence that they could also do that as well.
Heck, I mean, I'm just still digesting the serendipitous nature in which you were playing the piano with a shot off finger, Michael.
I didn't shoot off my finger, but the previous,
No.
yeah.
Right. Quite something how you ended up in that position.
Yeah.
What did that all mean to you? Like I read it in your bio, but you've said it again, the great equalizer. What did it mean to be in that space showing off your talents?
Well, it meant that the people tend to stereotype people with disabilities. They think, well, they have all these preconceived notions. And I kind of blew that out of the water when I got to play there. I mean, it was interesting too, the background of that. The owner, when he hired me, he actually went to the staff and asked, would they feel comfortable with me being in the room and playing the piano because of a disability? So he was kind of the bigot himself, but he did hire me for those reasons, as I mentioned, about, not having to pay me very much. But I really felt like I could, I was shy. So this kind of, it's like people that I guess that are ventriloquists or have these dummies, on their arm, and they get, that really makes them feel confident. Well, the piano did that for me. I mean, when people are clapping and saying you really moved me and stuff, it really raises your self-esteem.
Michael, were you aware in real time that the owner had been asking his staff questions about how they would feel with somebody with a disability in this space, and how do you navigate that?
I think I found out a little bit later. I was a bit shocked at first and thought, but it kind of fit the kind of the definition of who he was in a sense. I mean, he owned a TV store, and he was, pretty prudent, and so he wasn't exactly a stable guy himself, and I kind of knew that from the start. But I was grateful for the fact that he hired me, even though I was playing for $6 an hour. And I was playing 6 hours a night, 5 or 6 nights a week. So it was pretty grueling and exhausting. But I got some really nice tips, and I really craved that, I guess, that recognition and prestige that I got from playing the piano. That was the thing that really motivated me actually, more than the money in some ways.
Right.
Just,
And being seen. Yeah.
Yeah, being seen. I mean, I was really being seen then. I mean, people from all over Victoria would come up to that place. It was a, kind of a well-known hideout for people, because it was it was a grand piano, black grand piano in front of a fireplace, and and the chairs were surrounding the piano. So it couldn't have got much better from that point of view. And I reveled in that.
No kidding. No kidding. All right, Michael, thank you for that. Too often, I feel like athletes, when they're done their athletic career, they don't have pathways, Cynthia, to continue on and continue to be involved in their sport. What drove you to get the coaching certification and to continue to show up in this space, knowing that there are challenges, but yet you can make a difference for so many other people?
My major one is to like not be shy when it comes to like competing. A lot of people, when I became a coach, they came to me and said, Cynthia, Coach Cynthia, I don't not want to race. What is the point of going in a club and in a speed skating club when you don't want to race? You can't improve your skills, you can't improve and maintain your speed. It's very hard. And also my intellectual disability actually made me motivate myself more towards the sport and towards the whole thing and the career. But like I said to you, I moved to Kitchener from Yellowknife, and it was a very hard thing for me because there's no club near. The only club that is near Kitchener is basically London, Ontario, but like that's a 2 hours drive going there and coming back, and I do have a job, so I cannot so I have to like know what is the best way to. So my goal is actually to open a club in Waterloo or Kitchener eventually.
Well, I can't wait for that, and let me know, because we'll have a conversation about that. Just one last quick one for you, Cynthia. You talked about the challenge of the pass and the South Koreans specifically. You would have learned a lot about yourself when you had to think about how you were going to do that and the challenge of that. So maybe tell us about what you learned about yourself.
So
and the
for
challenge.
me, when I was racing and I had a challenge of racing involving other people, what my thing that helped me a lot was meditate and visualize before a race. Think of myself before my race. I do have a lot of friends that I had that helped me out throughout my whole career of speed skating and drafting me and maintaining my speed. I have a coach of mine that not on the special O side, but on my genetic side, I actually fantastically loved my coach then because he was lap timing me, telling me my lap times. That helps you a lot in speed skating, especially in speed skating. I don't know in other sports, but it helps you maintain your speed and know your speed. So example, on my last lap, he would tell me my lap time and I would know my lap time, and then I would maintain my speed and know if I need to go higher on my speed, medium speed, or reduce my speed. And it helped a lot. But on the other side, Special O didn't do that. My speed skating coach, when I did my races in Korea and South Korea, it was very hard. So what made me know my speed in that, I drafted some of the South Korean skaters, and I drafted someone that I know from Alberta. So
Perfect.
That helped.
That does help. And for anyone tuning in who might not be familiar with the term drafting, it's when you sort of slide in right behind an opponent. They create a bit of an air force, a block for you to sort of slide behind, and it creates an easier type of skating so that you can, lunge forward. So Cynthia seems to have found the recipe for that. Okay, Michael, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a part of your memoir that really struck me, and I'm wondering if we can get you to sort of react and elaborate on it, because it is powerful writing and powerful testimony. If you don't mind, Michael.
No.
Okay. So it says, disability has a way of rearranging the social furniture. It introduces uncertainty. People want to be helpful, but they also want to be correct. They worry about saying the wrong thing, so they say nothing or they speak around you instead of to you. I learned that early, that my body invited commentary. Teachers explain me to other teachers. Administrators explained me to parents. Doctors explained me to my parents while I lay on the examination table listening. Rarely did anyone explain with me. Over time, I absorbed the message that visibility came with conditions, that being acceptable meant being quiet, cooperative, and grateful, that asserting myself risked being labeled difficult, that silence was safer than correction. These lessons are subtle. They don't arrive as rules. They arrive as atmosphere. Michael, that's so incredibly powerful. Maybe can you just elaborate on that? Because I think it's just, I got goosebumps when I read it.
Well, I think I was always brought up with my father. He was an interesting fellow. He and I were very close, but he gave me double messages in the sense that he says, well, go out there and, and reach for whatever you want. And yet he was very, he was very kind of self-conscious about my disability and was overprotective. I mean, I lived at home till I was 53 years old. I hate to admit that, but it was true. Even though he said you can, he said to me, you can stay here as long as you like. At the same breath, he says, we'll go out and mix with people. But that thing about people often don't want to, they think that asking direct questions is somehow rude. And that, and often I found that people, doctors, and even my parents spoke for me, even though I was, quite articulate. They seemed to think it was their providence to, that I keep my mouth shut. And it is safer in some ways to keep your mouth shut. I mean, and yet you go around being not known. I remember when in the final year of high school, when they put in the annual, it says, well, Michael seems quiet and very nice, but we don't know him very well. So, I mean, I made, because of certain hidden disabilities I had, I tried to make myself kind of as inconspicuous as possible. And I know there's other people with disabilities who did the opposite. They kind of went out there and, made people notice them and did very kind of outlandish things just to kind of, well, see me kind of thing. But I was the opposite. I didn't want to be seen unless for later on, the piano was the way I kind of wanted to be seen. And it served as a positive way of being seen. I think a lot of people settle for negative, publicity rather than no publicity at all.
Mm.
And I chose, just to be quiet and for most of my life, except for through the piano. And I was much more outgoing on a one-to-one basis when I went out with my parents. I mean, I remember my aunt saying, well, I went over there for dinner once just by myself. She says, well, we finally got to know you. We never really got to know you because I just used to be in the background. Because probably I thought that was the safest way. Yeah.
Michael, this part where you say people want to be helpful, but they also want to be correct. They worry about saying the wrong thing. I'll be vulnerable with you all today. I've covered the last 5 Paralympics for CBC Sports, and I had almost this exact same experience because I was going into this world not wanting to say the wrong thing. But what I quickly realized is that it was really my intention behind my question and my curiosity that allowed me to show up in that space. And I was open about the fact that I might say the wrong thing, and I would hope that I wasn't here to offend. I wonder if you could tell people listening in today how they approach that and how they work through that. Maybe from your perspective, because you say they want to be helpful. They don't want to say the wrong thing, so they say nothing. So they speak around you instead of to you. How would you want them to speak to you, Michael?
Well, probably, I mean, I was brought up with that thing you said in the grocery store, that thing where the child was really curious as to who I was and why I was walking the way I did. However, he said it through his mother, what's wrong with that guy kind of thing. And his mother got all frustrated and got all basically very embarrassed. She says, we don't want to embarrass this guy. So there's kind of that duality going on. We don't want to embarrass him, but we, you know, it'd be nice to know what's going on. So they choose to reinforce in their child that sort of don't ask questions, and a sense of shame in a way that, you know, that they're asking that question. But children are kind of naturally curious, and and I was always kind of treated that way too, that my mother saw me, she loved me dearly, and so did my father, but they also were self-conscious in my presence. They told me I love to walk fast. They told me don't walk fast, people won't notice you as much. Well, my answer to that was, people are going to notice me anyway, so why not let me walk fast? Because I really enjoy walking fast. But they immediately thought it reflected on them that I was walking fast, and somehow they did not want to be seen in that way.
Wow. Wow.
Does that make sense? I mean,
It does make sense. And you know, I can't ever imagine how your parents were processing it, but they, in a lot of ways, were probably trying to do what they thought was best for you, and yet you're sharing sort of the adverse effects of that, right?
Yeah.
Huh.
They did think, you know, I was, so basically you tend to sometimes, a certain kind of shame I did internalize, more invisible disabilities, but that I couldn't see why they were so you know, upset that I was walking fast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to be, and I guess part of me did want to be seen by walking fast, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, as I get older now, I'm unable to walk fast, and I'm getting more and more disabled, and that really frustrates me, because in my head, I still want to walk fast. So I mean, I'm adjusting to that reality now. But in those, you know, in those early days, I didn't look pretty, but I sure could move fast, and I didn't care.
Outstanding. Thank
Yeah.
you. Really, really thank you for that, Michael. I thought that was super important to get to. Okay, Cynthia, here's one for you. How about this? If every Canadian could participate fully in sport, what is one benefit? I think there's a bunch, but I'll ask you one benefit you believe Canada would see as a whole, whether it be socially or culturally or nationally, if everybody could participate in sport, because you've shared it today. Not everybody can.
Yeah, that's true. Not everybody can. Not everybody has the luxury to go through it. Like I said before in this whole process, the equipment. One of the major things that I see a lot of challenges in the sport is the equipment. Not only you have to buy the equipment separately. So the blades and the boot comes separately. It does not come in one skate. It's not like hockey skates or figure skates or any other sports. It comes separately, and it's very pricey. It's not cheap. So I think it's the money wise. Some of the parents don't have that luxury to get their kids involved. I've seen in Yellowknife, when I grew up in Yellowknife, there's volunteering and there's stuff to provide for the club through like people that have a hard time getting to and from competition wise or anything like that. I did attend to a competition and I noticed a lot of stuff in the competition. It was one of the challenges for me was to know the skaters, to know how they are traveling. It's not the same when they are in the club in Yellowknife than when they have to travel and go in another place. Like Michael was saying too about bullying and going up front in a disability. I was bullied severely too when I was not in speed skating, but in my genetic of swimming. I did swimming before and I was bullied severely. I was left aside and the other group went on the other side and me and my dad was alone. I felt very, 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 very heartbroken. Like I said before to Allison, I have an intellectual disability. It's hidden. Not a lot of people know my disability, and it is very hard to be spoken about it. Before I was open about it. Now, because I got bullied so many times, I feel embarrassed to speak up about it. It was very hard for me to speak up. Sometimes I have to have my mom or my dad speak up for me and let them know. Sometimes I have support and help.
I'm so sorry that happened to you, Cynthia, relating to swimming. Was that part of the reason you're not swimming anymore? Did you leave?
That's one of the major reasons. Also, my coach that I had was not really fairly fair about anybody else. I do miss swimming. Swimming is 100% fantastic cardio. It was very helpful for me when I grew up, but with the people I had in the club and that, no, I'll never go back to that club.
Just one last follow-up, and so brave of you, Cynthia, and we're so grateful for you using your voice and speaking up. Were there people who supported you outside of your family? There are people on this panel watching today. What can those people do in moments like that to speak out and make a more welcoming space for people with, as you say, an invisible disability?
So for me, when I had the challenge to speak up, I meditated, I visualized, I asked for help, like a counselor or a psychiatrist or my family doctor. I went in beyond my space and I asked for help. I am not a person to ask for help. I am not a person to speak up when something is wrong. So after I left my parents' side, it was very hard and tough for me, but I picked up my speed and I picked up my momentum and I went out and asked for help.
Very good to hear that. Thank you for sharing all of that, Cynthia. Michael, you hear Cynthia talk about bullying, and we're talking about, participating fully in all parts of society. And we've heard your story about, being in the space of being able to play the piano and how helpful that was to you. Not everybody gets that opportunity. And there are places where they're not even going to allow a person with disabilities to have an option. How harmful is that to society as a whole? Because not everybody is afforded the opportunity to speed skate, to play the piano, whatever the case may be.
I think it's harmful to people because they see themselves as less than, and they feel like they're invisible. So, unless they meet a certain standard, as you said, we're lucky that we have certain skills that have made us stand out and allowed us to shine and feel good about ourselves.
How do you think the country would change, just directly to that question, if every Canadian could participate freely, fully in sport and leisure? What are the benefits this country would see from a fully inclusive society?
Well, I think it would, normalize a lot of people like myself. If people have enough experience with you and deal with you on a regular basis, the disability starts becoming invisible, and the real person shines out, or stands out, and you're not labeled. They see the person first after they get to know you, rather than the disability. But if they keep them, keep hidden, I mean, it's basically a real. They actually first people's opinion of you, or how they are perceived, is more of a disability than the disability itself, and how you perceive yourself. And so I think people need to be integrated. And although I think in the 1980s, I remember I was taking a PDPP program, which is supposed to be a professional program, and they were starting to expand, their viewpoint of disabilities. And they said, "Oh yeah, you're going to have to take PE." So they put me in a PE class. However, because I didn't have the scaffolding or or actually training when I was younger on how to do things like that. They were teaching. They expected me to teach volleyball, but they didn't. They wanted me to kind of instantly figure it out, kind of thing, just with how, and didn't really tailor it to my background. It was kind of ignorant in a lot of ways. They just they applied it in a very symbolic way with no structure behind it, or no understanding of how somebody like me may be sort of set up to fail rather than succeed.
Ignorant is one word for it.
Yeah.
I could think of other ones.
Yeah.
That's Michael.
Yeah.
Hey, just quickly as we sort of wind down here, just picking up on that, you talk about that in the 80s, and I want to believe that we've evolved as a society a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
But where would you say we're at when it comes to literacy and compassion and awareness of people living with disabilities in this country today compared to the horror story you tell us from the 80s? And I'm sure you have a long list of them.
Well, I think I think in a lot of places, like I go to a fairly liberal United Church, and they are very accepting in a lot of ways, but a lot of times the acceptance in certain places can be symbolic, and there's a big difference between symbolic acceptance and structural acceptance, where people are really included. Symbolic is kind of like we'll accept you kind of thing, and assimilate you. But if you put too much kind of demand on us, then that changes everything. They want to be seen including other people, but the sort of that colonial viewpoint, which pervades people, Aboriginal people, and also other minorities, is still there, although it's a lot more subtle. And they can convince themselves, because we've got the language for it now, and we've we do all these symbolic things, we don't have to work at it. It's kind of, Western society is very goal oriented in that way, and it's a process, and being process oriented is a lot different than being goal oriented. It's never over. It's an ongoing learning experience. And I think we're getting there, but we've got a long way to go in a lot of ways, because even with things like indents on curbs and things to help wheelchairs go up, they often they do it symbolically, in the sense they put them in the weirdest places and actually create sometimes more dangers for people than they're helping them, because they're doing it just to kind of say, we did it, tick, token. And that's not good enough, but
yeah, that's a big takeaway, that process versus goal. And just, if you can check a box and say we did it and we're moving on, versus no, the work continues on a daily practice, no doubt.
Right.
Okay, we're running up against time, but I think this is important. Cynthia, over to you for our panelists. If you could leave them with one message that they could take away about your story, what sport has meant to you, and what you hope they take away from today and your story, what would it be?
Don't be shy to compete. Go out there, compete. It's off to you guys to try to challenge them. They are very challenging, but yeah, don't be shy. Going out there, making a good perspective of your sport, showing your experience, showing your passion about it. It's the wonderful thing I've experienced. I loved it. I missed it. I miss it actually 100%, but I'm still involved.
I love it. It is so fantastic, Cynthia. You've made it your own. You've been so resilient. You've stared down these challenges, and you keep showing up. Thank you for that. Michael, same question to you as we wind down, and both of you, thank you for sharing all of this. But one message, which is tough to do, but if you could, one message, what would it be?
I guess maybe I could say that I'm more than the sum of my parts. See me as a whole person, and allow me to express myself as a whole person, and throw the stereotypes away. Stereotypes allow us to kind of maintain our prejudices underneath, and just be open to finding out who I really am.
That is
Me first, the disability second, not vice versa.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it, and a wonderful, poignant message. Cynthia, Michael, brilliant stuff from the both of you. So grateful for all your vulnerability and all your sharing today. I think there are a lot of things we can take away, and when you talk about moving through our daily life, person first, disability second. That is powerful stuff. I want to thank you both. I want to thank Easter Seals Canada for putting this on. I know, again, like I said, starting off, this was to celebrate National Accessibility Week, but in a way, this is beautiful because it is an everyday thing, right? An everyday practice, not just a week out of the year. It's every day. So this was the Sport and Leisure Making Play Possible for All panel. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you all today. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us all.
Thank you. You've been a great host.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. A real pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much to Easter Seals Canada for having me, and a real pleasure to join my colleagues, Michelle and Jay. I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves and share a little bit about who they are, what they do, and why procurement matters to them. So with that, I'll start with you, Michelle, and then right over to you, Jay.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Michelle Mahoney. I am the Accessibility Officer at the University of King's College. I live with a physical disability. I was born with a physical disability. I sit on the board of directors for Easter Seals Nova Scotia, the board of directors for Easter Seals Canada. Procurement, in my world, procurement is about making sure that products, services, and decisions an organization invests in work for everyone, not just most people. It's not simply about purchasing the cheapest or most readily available option. It's about asking who will use a product, who's going to be excluded by it, and how can we make choices that are accessible from the start. As someone with a disability, I've learned that many barriers are created long before a person even encounters them. They're often created when decisions are made without considering different needs and experiences. Procurement gives us an opportunity to change that. A great example of this is the work that I did with Air Canada on their straw pilot project, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. On the surface, procurement was about selecting a straw for use on flights. But from my perspective, it was about ensuring that passengers with disabilities could independently access the beverages being served. The decision wasn't just about cost or sustainability, it was also about dignity, autonomy, and inclusion. Procurement has the power to remove barriers before they are created. When accessibility is considered during the purchasing process, organizations avoid having to retrofit solutions later and create better experiences for everyone. So in short, procurement is where inclusion becomes action.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're really looking forward to hearing your Air Canada story. Accessible transportation is a big issue, not just in this country, but around the world. Jay, over to you. Always good to see you. So tell us about yourself, your company, and the incredible things you're doing to transform procurement in Canada.
Thank you so much, Karen, Michelle, and Easter Seals Canada. It's an honor to be here. So my name is Jay. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a medical robotics company that's deeply rooted in providing, with the mission of providing accessible transportation and transfer to everyone. So what we do is we have the first of its kind technology in the world that can move individuals, today it's patients in hospitals, between different surfaces. And the core of this technology started off in long-term care in figuring out how we can allow individuals to stay at home longer with restricted mobility. How can we get individuals between, let's say, beds to wheelchairs in an autonomous fashion? Today, where we are is we're the first of its kind technology that can move patients in hospitals from a lying down state to a lying down state, but very much it's core to our mission in figuring out how procurement is conducted, value-driven procurement, because as Michelle hinted at, today, healthcare procurement is looking at what's cheapest and replacing one widget with another. We're really passionate about how innovation can provide a ray of hope, a practical ray of hope in providing an environment where technology can benefit all, not just few. So in our world, we work with leading healthcare facilities across North America, actually, not just Canada, in figuring out what model can work for them in procuring technologies that haven't existed before. Because today, it's an interesting time where technology is actually, it's evolving. However, the procurement pathways have not caught up, and that's equally as important if you want to have impact with technology.
Jay, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to digging in a couple of minutes on a little bit more on the pioneering work you're doing around the world and at home. But Michelle, I'm going to hop back to the Air Canada story. So could you tell me, and you know, I wish we had all day, but we have a couple of minutes for you each for the next question. So first question of the next is for Michelle. So your story with Air Canada, tell us how working with Air Canada in, you know, two or 3 minutes or so directly changed the procurement process at one of the world's biggest airlines. I mean, that's no small feat. Like, what did you do and what happened?
So thanks, Karen. I was invited by Air Canada and Easter Seals Canada to speak to the Air Canada Senior Staff Summit in January of 2024. And I was there to talk about accessibility and travel, two things that are deeply connected but often overlooked. I was joined by Canada's Chief Accessibility Officer, Stephanie Cadeau, who shared her experience of arriving at a destination only to discover that her wheelchair had been left behind. That's a big deal. It's a powerful reminder for many of us that accessibility isn't a luxury or convenience. It's dignity, independence, autonomy. A wheelchair is not a set of golf clubs. So during my talk, I focused on something much smaller, but just as important: straws on airplanes. For many people, a straw seems like a small thing. For me, it's an essential tool. I use a straw for every beverage I drink. If you're serving a meal on an airplane, you provide a fork. If you're serving a drink, there should be a straw available for passengers who might need one. A straw is just as important to me as a fork is to someone else. So what changed was that Air Canada listened. They listened to me. They didn't just hear the story and move on. They invited me to help find a solution. So they sent me 21 different straws to test in 21 different envelopes, along with a spreadsheet to evaluate each one. So a colleague and I booked out a boardroom and we tested them in hot drinks and in cold drinks. We let them sit in liquid for a while to see how they would hold up. After a lot of sipping and soaking and spreadsheeting, I submitted my recommendations. So thanks to that work and the efforts of many people behind the scenes, straws became available on Air Canada flights on November 19th, 2024. And, you know, it may seem like a really small change, but for many passengers, it means being able to drink independently. That's what accessibility procurement can do. A conversation about a straw turned into real action. And I'm also invited to sit on Air Canada's Accessibility Advisory Committee starting January 2027.
Michelle, we're so proud of you and we're so excited, but also this is an example that when it comes to procurement, sometimes a change is a change you're already making. You're deciding to buy the best product that suits the needs of all. So thank you. Maybe in a year, you and Rob can convene and you can update him on a webinar or another event and tell him all about all the, the updates. With that, I'm going to go to Jay. And so Jay, this is something Jay and I are both really passionate about, which is buying accessible and buying Canadian. And so we know that procurement is also economic strategy, it's sovereignty strategy. Jay, feel free to go as broad or as detailed as you want on this. But how can buying accessible and buying Canadian drive innovation and inclusion? And, you know, if you want to tell us what works and what doesn't work in procurement, I'd love that too. So the floor is yours. Take, you know, 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll be here listening.
We could talk about this for hours, but I'll try to be
Okay.
as succinct as possible, because, you know, procurement, especially in Canada, it's a bit of a superpower if we choose to wield it wisely, because, you know, procuring is a driver of economic growth, and it's also a method. It's also a spend, and if we are spending capital wisely in a manner that drives our internal flywheel of innovation manufacturing, you will develop that critical mass that's needed to be not just self-sustainable, but become more and more innovative and lead the world, which is why I believe $1 spent on, let's say, something made in China versus $1.50 spent on something made in Canada. Which one is better? I would argue the $1.50, even though it costs a little bit more, especially if it's public capital, because it's going back into the public sector or into our economic engine, where we're hiring highly skilled individuals here in Canada. We're setting up manufacturing and critical supply chain, which we are woefully behind, especially when you compare it to China. Now, US is really engaging in industrial policy. Canada is it's a welcoming country. The US is putting deterrence. I'm not arguing for that, but, you know, there are tariffs in the US as a means to incentivize domestic procurement. In Canada, we really have to lean on our values, because when we do speak to leading organizations, we get this frank feedback, which is we would love to procure Canadian technologies, but our budgets are so tight. This is not a luxury that we have. And that is something that I can empathize with. So for operators, it's increasingly difficult, but for policy writers and those setting these budgets, I think it's incredibly important for them to recognize that this dynamic exists. And just saying we want to buy Canadian is not enough. There has to be actual policy exceptions made to be able to acquire Canadian. Like in Quebec, there are certain tolerances where you can procure from a Quebec-made company, even if they're 25% higher than the lowest international bid. So that's where jurisdictions and healthcare operators or public operators can work together in driving this economic engine. And then I'll also say, you know, as a Canadian company, we work very closely with the needs of our Canadian clients. And I would argue that that's just not possible with a company that's not located here. We understand our problems, our values, and our culture better than anybody else. And we can also provide a better product and service in addition to the economic benefit that procurement can provide.
Thank you. And Jay, just a follow-on question. So if you could change one thing about the procurement process, I know there's many, but like if there was a short-term win and a long-term win, hate to put you on the spot, but what's your short-term win? What's your long-term win?
I would really like to see bespoke budgets allocated and protected for innovation procurement, because innovation is not an option. Right now, innovation is fighting for the same dollars as fixing holes in a wall. Same with accessibility. If a hospital is struggling to close up holes in a wall, are they going to be able to procure leading technology that helps and brings more accessibility? Probably not. So what I'm looking for is a protected budget that cannot be used for hospital operations, but should be used for technologies that really help us get out of this paradigm that we are in, which really does look at accessibility and innovation in a dedicated manner.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to go to our final question of the day before we do a little wrap up. And our final question of the day, I'm going to kind of combine the last two questions. So if everyone watching today, including leaders in government, business leaders, could leave with one message from you, Michelle, what would your message be?
Well, I think a future with accessible procurement is a future where accessibility is built in from the beginning instead of an afterthought. Accessibility instead of an afterthought. It means organizations aren't asking, how do we accommodate this person after a barrier has already been created? Instead, they're asking, how do we make sure everyone can use this from the start? For people with disabilities, that means greater independence, dignity, and equal participation. It means being able to travel, work, learn, and access services without constantly having to ask for special arrangements. I've seen firsthand how a procurement design can make a difference. A straw on an airplane may seem like a small thing, but for some, it means being able to independently enjoy a drink during a flight. That's the power of accessible procurement. Small decisions can have a huge impact on people's daily lives. If I could leave public servants with one message today, it would be never underestimate the impact of the decisions you make every day. Accessibility doesn't happen by accident. I heard that earlier as well. It happens because someone chose to think about it. Procurement may seem like a small part of the process, but it has the power to create real change. The future I want to see is one where accessibility is no longer a special feature. It's simply the standard. Accessibility is considered before a purchase is made, not after. When we make thoughtful decisions and include people with lived experience, we create a society that works better for everyone.
Michelle, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in Halifax later today or tomorrow. Jay, over to you. Public, if not just our public service, but of other business leaders and innovators like you, government leaders, social sector leaders, could hear this conversation. What does the future look like where procurement is embedded in, and accessibility are embedded into what we buy? So, I know maybe that's a little bit repetition from a prior question, but just curious to hear your parting thoughts and anything else you'd like to say.
Yeah, first of all, I'd say I couldn't say it any better than Michelle. Very, very well put. So I'll try to add a little bit to what you said, like that the value basis, allowing organizations to procure based on values and accessibility at its core is incredibly important because it's not an afterthought. Same with procurement. We spend about 12.7% of our GDP on healthcare. That is not just, it impacts each and every one of us. And how we make these procurement decisions and the values we choose will also will impact us on a day-to-day level, not just from a healthcare level, from how much taxes we pay. And one thing that I want to highlight is, it's a Charlie Munger quote. He said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." I would say to our policymakers that you need to incentivize in policy adoption of accessible standards, adoption of innovative methods, because that's the only way we can leverage our muscle, which is really this, spending $300 billion on procuring items. Like, that's a big economic muscle. We can use that as leverage and not something that is antiquated and a weakness, to look at a Canada that is in fact leading the world through innovation, through procurement, through accessibility.
Jay, thank you. And we look forward to catching up again, maybe in a year, and learning what your company's doing. But again, to everyone watching, Jay and Michelle leading in education and transportation, Jay leading in the healthcare sector, both of them impacting not just Canadians, but individuals around the world living with disabilities. Because you may be watching this at home or at your office, I'd like to say a special thanks to Rob and the team at Easter Seals Canada. They've worked really hard on the production of this with Jay and with Allison. And a big shout out to Allison Dunn, our conference coordinator, who's worked so very hard and experienced all the fun that comes with conference planning. So Michelle, well done. Allison, well done. Michelle and Jay, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. And, I hope we'll make sure your messages travel very far to all those that should hear them. So many thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.
As we bring this conference to a close, I hope you leave feeling encouraged by the ideas shared, inspired by the innovation showcased, and motivated by the collective commitment demonstrated throughout today's discussions. From housing and employment to sport, recreation, and procurement, a common theme has emerged. Building a more accessible Canada requires intentional action, collaboration, and leadership. Accessibility is not the responsibility of any one organization or sector. You know, it's a shared endeavor that depends on governments and businesses and community organizations and individuals working together to remove barriers and create opportunities. You know, the conversations that we've had today remind us that accessibility is grounded in both national and international commitments. The Accessible Canada Act's vision of barrier-free Canada by 2040, together with the principles of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, challenge us to remove barriers and advance dignity, inclusion, independence, and full participation for all. At this time, I want to acknowledge the importance of national leadership in advancing accessibility and inclusion. You know, meaningful progress is made when policy and investment, lived experience, and community expertise come together with a common purpose. We're grateful for the continued support of Employment and Social Development Canada and for the commitment of all those working to advance the vision of a barrier-free Canada. My sincere thanks to our outstanding panelists and moderators for sharing their expertise, their insights, and their lived experiences today. Thank you as well to our project partners, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work and Indigenous Disability Canada BCANDS, for their collaboration bringing this event to life. As organizers, we were intentional in our efforts to center lived experience and to ensure that our speakers reflected a diversity of perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences. But, you know, unfortunately, the need to reschedule this event somewhat affected our ability to fully realize that vision. We want to acknowledge and sincerely thank those who were able to participate today, also recognizing those who had originally committed to sharing their voices and expertise, but were ultimately unable to join us. We're grateful to each and every one of them for their willingness to contribute to this important conversation and remain committed to continuing to elevate diverse voices in our work moving forward. I'd also like to recognize the many individuals working behind the scenes to ensure this conference was accessible to all participants, including our ASL and LSQ interpreters and CART captioners, translators, and Jason Perrier for providing technical support throughout. And I would certainly be remiss if I didn't extend a very special thank you to Allison Dunn, our conference coordinator. You know, Allison has worked tirelessly behind the scenes for many months to plan, coordinate, and oversee countless details to ensure that today's event was a success. In a few moments, a QR code will appear on the screen linking to our post-conference survey. You will also receive the survey link by email in the coming days. You know, the survey should take no more than a few minutes to complete, and we would really greatly appreciate your feedback. National Accessibility and Awareness Week may have ended, but the work of building an accessible and inclusive Canada continues. It continues in our workplaces, our communities, our policies, and most importantly, in our everyday decisions. Let us leave here committed not only to imagining what is possible, but to take the actions necessary to create a Canada where everyone can participate fully, contribute meaningfully, and thrive. Thank you.